In the closing years of the 11th century, Europe was a land torn apart by violence. Kings fought their own brothers. Lords raided their neighbors' lands. Knights, trained from childhood to wield sword and lance, had no great cause left to fight for. The feudal system had created thousands of restless warriors, with energy to burn and sins weighing heavy on their souls. Then, in November 1095, in a small French town called Clermont, Pope Urban II stepped forward and changed the course of history forever. He stood before a vast crowd of clergy and nobles. The air was cold, but his words burned like fire. He spoke of the suffering in the east, how the Seljuk Turks had smashed the Christian Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, how holy pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem were robbed, beaten, and sometimes killed, how churches were desecrated, altars turned into stables, and Christian women taken as slaves. But Urban did not stop at describing pain. He offered redemption. "My brothers," he cried, "God himself commands you. Take up the cross. March to the Holy Land. Free the city where Christ walked, where he was crucified and rose again. If you do this, all your sins will be forgiven. Those who die on this journey will receive immediate entry into paradise." "Deus Vult!" the crowd roared back. "God wills it." Men tore their cloaks and sewed red crosses onto their shoulders. Knights who had spent years fighting each other now wept with religious fervour. Peasants, merchants, even women and children felt the call. This was no ordinary war. This was a holy pilgrimage armed with swords, a chance to wash away sin with blood and faith. But the first ones to answer were not the great princes with their armoured knights. They were the poor and the desperate, led by a barefoot preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Tens of thousands left their homes in the spring of 1096. They carried nothing but faith and whatever they could beg or steal along the way. This became known as the People's Crusade, and it would end in one of the most tragic disasters of the entire expedition. Peter the Hermit rode ahead on his donkey, preaching day and night. Walter the Penniless tried to bring some order, but it was impossible. The army was a chaotic mix of farmers, old men, women carrying infants, and boys who had never held a real weapon. As they crossed Germany, religious zeal turned into something darker. In the Rhineland cities like Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, the Crusaders turned their anger on the Jewish communities who had lived there peacefully for centuries. Entire families were slaughtered in the name of the cross. Blood flowed in the streets while the killers shouted, "Deus Vult." By the time they reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexius I looked at this ragged horde with horror. He quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, hoping the Turks would deal with them. He was right. In October 1096, near a place called Civito, the Seljuk Turks under Kili Arslan attacked. The Crusaders had no armour, no discipline, and almost no weapons. Women and children screamed as Turkish horse archers rained arrows down. Men were cut down where they stood. Peter the Hermit barely escaped back to Constantinople with a handful of survivors. The rest were killed or sold into slavery. The People's Crusade was over almost before it began. A terrible warning of what happens when faith marches without preparation or leadership. Yet the real army, the one history would remember, was already gathering. The great princes of Europe were coming with thousands of trained knights. From late 1096 through early 1097, 4 main armies set out from different parts of Europe. Godfrey of Bouillon, the tall and pious Duke of Lower Lorraine, led one force with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin. Bohemond of Taranto, a giant Norman warrior known for his ambition and battlefield skill, brought hardened fighters from southern Italy. Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest and richest, marched with the largest contingent, accompanied by the papal legate Bishop Adhemar. Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and others completed the host. These were not peasants. These were professional warriors with chainmail, heavy horses, and years of fighting experience. They converged on Constantinople. Emperor Alexius demanded they swear an oath. Any lands they captured from the Turks would be returned to the Byzantine Empire. Most agreed, though some like Bohemond did so with gritted teeth. Then they crossed into Anatolia. The heat was merciless. Waterholes were few, but their first real test came at Dorylaeum in July 1097. The Turkish Sultan Kilij Arslan surrounded them with swift horse archers. Arrows darkened the sky. For hours, the Crusaders seemed on the brink of destruction. Then the separate columns finally linked up. The heavy Western knights lowered their lances and charged like an iron avalanche. The Turks broke and fled, leaving their camp and riches behind. Victory brought new confidence. The army marched onward through burning heat and dusty plains, until in late October 1097 they stood before the massive walls of Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. No one imagined the nightmare that awaited them there. The siege of Antioch began on 21st October 1097 and would last nearly 8 brutal months. The city was enormous, protected by mountains, the Orontes River, and seemingly impregnable walls. Inside, Governor Yagisian prepared a stubborn defense. Outside, the Crusaders quickly ran out of food. Winter rains turned the ground into a sea of mud. Horses died by the hundreds. Men boiled leather belts and chewed roots. Chroniclers later wrote that some, driven mad by hunger, resorted to eating the flesh of dead Turks, a horror that still shocks us today. Desertions increased. Morale sank so low that many believed God had abandoned them. Then came a moment that would decide everything. A poor soldier named Peter Bartholomew claimed a vision. The Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath the floor of St. Peter's Church inside Antioch. They dug where he pointed and found an iron spearhead. Whether it was truly the holy relic or not, the army exploded with renewed faith. But faith alone was not enough. A Muslim captain named Firuz, angry with his own leaders, secretly agreed to betray the city. On the night of 23rd of June 1098, a small group of Crusaders scaled the walls and opened the gates. The Crusaders poured in. The streets of Antioch ran with blood as they took revenge for months of suffering. Joy lasted only days. A massive Turkish relief army under Kerbaga arrived and trapped the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. Starvation returned worse than before. On 28th June 1098, with almost nothing left to lose, the Crusaders marched out carrying the Holy Lance high. Against overwhelming odds, they charged. Kerbaga's huge army mysteriously broke and fled in panic. Antioch was theirs. But the Crusader army was now a shadow of its former self, exhausted, diseased, and reduced in numbers. Still, one final goal burned in their hearts: Jerusalem. By early 1099, only around 12,000 Crusaders remained. They marched south through scorching heat, poisoned wells, and constant harassment. On 7th of June 1099, they finally saw the golden domes of Jerusalem. The Fatimid rulers had strengthened the walls and poisoned the surrounding water sources. The Crusaders had almost no siege engines at first. They built towers under arrow fire, prayed, fasted, and walked barefoot in procession around the city walls. On 15th of July 1099, the final assault began. Godfrey of Bouillon's men pushed a siege tower against the northern wall. A knight named Lethold was among the first to reach the top. Others followed. The gates were forced open. What happened next is one of the most controversial moments in medieval history. For 2 days, the Crusaders killed without mercy. Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the streets, in homes, and even inside the sacred sites. Eyewitness Raymond of Aguilera wrote that in the temple area, men rode in blood up to their knees and the bridles of their horses. Other chroniclers describe piles of heads, hands, and feet. By the time the killing stopped, Jerusalem belonged to the Crusaders. They had achieved what seemed impossible after 3 years of marching, starving, and fighting across thousands of miles. Godfrey of Bouillon became the first ruler, refusing the title of king and calling himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. With Jerusalem captured, the great Crusader army began to dissolve. Many knights, having fulfilled their vow, returned home to Europe. Those who stayed faced a harsh new reality. They were a tiny Christian island surrounded by a vast Muslim world that now saw them as foreign invaders. 4 Crusader states emerged: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa under Baldwin, the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond, and later the County of Tripoli. At first they seemed strong, but deep cracks were already there. The leaders fought among themselves. Bohemond and Raymond had clashed bitterly over Antioch. Supply lines were long and dangerous. Local Muslim rulers, initially divided, began to unite against the common enemy. In the decades that followed, one state after another would fall. Edessa was lost in 1144. Jerusalem itself would be recaptured by Saladin in 1187. The First Crusader army had risen like a sudden storm, driven by faith, ambition, desperation, and raw courage. It had redrawn the map of the medieval world and planted the idea of holy war deep in both Christian and Muslim minds. Yet the same forces that created it, religious zeal mixed with human greed and violence, also carried the seeds of its eventual collapse. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Holy Land would slowly fade over the next 200 years. But the story of that first extraordinary march, of ordinary men enduring hell for what they believed was God's will, continues to fascinate and disturb us even today. That, my friends, is the complete rise and fall of the First Crusader army.